He had already decided the date was over before he admitted to himself that he cared. The cafe clock ticked too loudly, each second stretching the silence as snow pressed harder against the windows, burying the city in white. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but he hadn't touched it since, as if warmth itself no longer applied to him. Blind dates were for people who still believed love arrived on schedule. He was a single father. His life ran on missed calls, unfinished plans, and promises reshaped by responsibility. He checked his phone one last time, not expecting anything, and felt that familiar, quiet sting, the one that came when hope showed up uninvited and left without explanation. Pulling on his coat, he stood, ready to return to the safety of certainty, where disappointment at least was predictable. Then the door swung open. Winter rushed inside first, sharp and breathless, followed by a woman dusted in snow, eyes wide, searching, carrying the kind of urgency that only comes from being late for something that matters. Their gazes met, and in that suspended moment, between leaving and staying, between giving up and trying again, she spoke, her voice steady despite the storm clinging to her shoulders. "I'm your date." The world outside disappeared, and suddenly, the night felt less like an ending and more like the moment right before a life quietly changes. He did not answer her right away, not because he was angry, but because something inside him had stalled, like an engine refusing to turn over after a long winter. For a moment he simply stood there, one hand still gripping the back of the chair, the other hanging uselessly at his side, watching snow melt into dark specks on the wooden floor beneath her boots. She looked as though she had run the last stretch, hair slightly undone, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes bright with apology and determination tangled together. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, before he could speak, before silence could harden into something unforgiving. "I know I'm late. Everything went wrong. The buses stopped, my phone died, and then the storm just—" She gestured vaguely toward the window, where the snow fell heavier now, thick enough to swallow sound. He finally nodded, a small motion that surprised even him, and pulled the chair out again, motioning for her to sit. "It's okay," he heard himself say, though he wasn't entirely sure when okay had become possible. She sat across from him, peeling off her gloves with clumsy fingers, her breath slowly evening out as warmth returned to her hands. The cafe smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon, and somewhere behind the counter a machine hissed, filling the space with a comforting, ordinary sound that made the moment feel less fragile. He introduced himself, his name sounding strangely formal in his own ears, and she did the same, smiling with a softness that didn't feel rehearsed. For a few minutes they hovered on the surface of things, talking about the storm, about how sudden it had been, about how the city always seemed unprepared for weather that demanded patience. He ordered her a hot drink, insisting when she tried to refuse, and watched as color slowly returned to her face. He told himself not to read into the way she thanked him, not to mistake politeness for interest. Yet he noticed the way she wrapped both hands around the mug as if anchoring herself, the way her shoulders finally relaxed. He asked about her day, about what she did for work, questions he had practiced answering himself out of habit more than hope. She answered easily, thoughtfully, asking him things in return, and it startled him how natural it felt to respond. Still, a quiet tension remained, born from the simple fact that he had already prepared himself to leave. He had rehearsed disappointment, folded it neatly into his coat pocket, and now he didn't know where to put it. When she asked why he'd agreed to a blind date, he hesitated, then shrugged lightly. "I was told it would be good for me," he said, half smiling. She laughed softly, not mockingly, but with recognition. "That's usually a bad sign," she replied, and something loosened between them. The lights flickered without warning, once, twice, before plunging the cafe into darkness. A collective murmur rose from the few remaining patrons, followed by the cafe owner's calm voice reassuring everyone it was likely temporary. Candles appeared on tables, small flames casting uneven shadows across faces and walls, turning the room intimate in a way that felt unplanned and strangely honest. The storm outside had intensified, wind howling now, snow slamming sideways against the glass, and the world beyond the cafe seemed to shrink, reduced to this circle of light and warmth. He found himself talking about his daughter without meaning to, mentioning her the way people mention gravity, something constant and defining. He spoke of mornings that began too early, of lunches packed with care, of bedtime stories read with voices he hadn't known he possessed until she was born. He did not speak of her mother at first, skirting that absence instinctively, but he saw the way the woman across from him listened, truly listened, not interrupting, not rushing to fill pauses, allowing silence to exist without fear. When he finally mentioned the word single, it landed softly between them, not as an apology but as a fact. "It's just the two of us," he said. "It has been for a while." She nodded, eyes thoughtful, and said, "That sounds full," choosing the word carefully. He smiled, surprised by the accuracy. Outside, a siren wailed briefly before being swallowed by wind. The cafe owner announced that the storm had closed several roads and that public transport was being suspended indefinitely, an announcement met with resigned sighs and nervous laughter. The date, once fragile and uncertain, stretched before them now, unbound by schedules. She shared more about herself then, about moving cities, about work that involved caring for children who weren't hers, about learning how to give without expecting permanence in return. There was a shadow there. He sensed it, something unspoken that hovered behind her words, but he did not push. Instead, he told her about the nights when exhaustion felt heavier than grief, about the fear that he was failing his daughter simply by being human. His voice remained steady, but his hands tightened around his cup, and she noticed, reaching across the table without thinking, her fingers brushing his briefly before retreating, an apology already forming on her lips. He shook his head slightly, a silent reassurance that the contact had not been unwelcome. Time moved differently after that, slipping past unnoticed as candles burned lower and conversation deepened, laughter finding its way into stories that had once felt too heavy to share. When the cafe finally announced it was closing, apologetic but firm, they bundled themselves into coats, reluctant, stepping back into a city transformed. Snow lay thick and untouched, streetlights glowing like distant stars, and the air was sharp enough to sting. He offered to walk her part of the way, an offer she accepted without hesitation, and they moved slowly, mindful of slick pavement, their footsteps the only sound between gusts of wind. She told him about the night she decided to accept the blind date, about nearly canceling, about the strange pull that made her show up anyway, even as everything conspired to keep her away. He admitted that he had almost left, that he had stood with his coat on, ready to give up. She laughed softly, shaking her head, and said, "I guess the storm had other plans." They stopped at a corner where her building rose out of the white like something newly discovered, and for a moment neither spoke. Snow settled on their shoulders again, quiet and persistent. "Thank you," she said finally, "not just for the walk, but for staying." He nodded, feeling something warm and unfamiliar settle in his chest. They did not hug. They did not promise anything beyond a tentative exchange of numbers, fingers brushing again, this time lingering just a second longer. As he watched her disappear inside, he realized that the disappointment he had prepared earlier no longer fit. Walking home through the snow, he felt tired, deeply so. But beneath it was a cautious, glowing sense of possibility, the kind that didn't demand belief, only openness. And as the storm continued to fall, blanketing the city in quiet, he wondered, for the first time in a long while, what it might mean to arrive somewhere not on time, but exactly when you were meant to. Morning arrived without ceremony. The storm had not ended so much as loosened its grip, leaving the city wrapped in a pale, exhausted quiet. He woke before his alarm, a habit carved into him by years of early mornings and small hands tugging at his sleeve. For a few seconds he lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muted sounds of snowplows somewhere far away, and felt the strange after-image of the night before, hovering just out of reach. It took him a moment to remember why his chest felt lighter, why the usual weight of the day had not yet settled in. Then he saw her face again, framed by candlelight and falling snow, heard her voice saying his name as if it mattered, and the memory slid into place. He got up quietly, careful not to wake his daughter, and moved through the familiar morning rituals with practiced ease. Breakfast, backpack, boots lined by the door. When she padded into the kitchen, hair a mess, eyes still half lost in dreams, he felt the familiar swell of love ground him again. "Did your date go bad?" she asked bluntly, spoon clinking against her bowl, because children had a way of cutting straight to the point. He paused, considering the answer, then smiled. "No," he said. "It went different." She accepted that without question, already distracted by the window, by the way the world looked softer under snow. After walking her to school, he stood outside longer than usual, watching children scatter across the playground, steam rising from their breaths, and felt the night tug at him again, gentle but insistent. At work, concentration came and went. He found himself replaying moments he hadn't realized were significant at the time. The way she tilted her head when listening, the brief silence before laughter, the careful way she chose certain words, as if afraid of breaking something fragile. He wondered what she was doing now, whether she too felt the echo of the storm lingering in her thoughts, or whether the night had already folded itself neatly into memory. He told himself not to romanticize it. One evening, one connection, no promises. He had learned the danger of building futures from moments. Still, when his phone buzzed during lunch and her name appeared on the screen, his heart betrayed him, quickening before he could stop it. The message was simple, thanking him again, hoping he'd gotten home safely, mentioning the snow outside her window. He stared at it longer than necessary, then typed a reply, deleted it, typed another, finally settling on something equally simple. The exchange did not last long, but when it ended, he felt as though a thread had been tied between them, thin but real. Over the next few days, the storm's aftermath reshaped routines. Schools delayed openings, streets remained narrowed by walls of snow. Life slowed, forcing pauses where there had once been urgency. Their messages grew more frequent, never overwhelming, never demanding, just enough to weave themselves into the fabric of his days. They spoke about small things at first, books, favorite meals, the absurdity of weather forecasts, then gradually edged closer to the truths they had circled before. She told him more about her work, about the children she cared for temporarily, about learning to love fiercely while knowing goodbyes were inevitable. He sensed the ache beneath her words, the discipline it took to open herself repeatedly, and felt a quiet admiration take root. When he shared stories of his daughter, of the ways parenthood had reshaped him, she asked questions that surprised him, not out of curiosity but out of genuine interest, as if understanding his life mattered to her. They met again a week later, deliberately this time, choosing a small bookstore cafe where shelves leaned close and time seemed less rigid. There was no storm to trap them, no emergency to force intimacy, and he wondered briefly whether the magic would evaporate under normal circumstances. It didn't. Conversation flowed with an ease that unsettled him, touching on deeper waters now. He told her about the night his life split into before and after, about loss that still surfaced unexpectedly, about learning how to be strong in ways he had never planned. She listened, eyes shining, and when she spoke of her own loss, of a future she had once assumed was guaranteed, he felt the room contract around them, as if the world understood the importance of what was being shared. Their hands found each other across the table this time without hesitation, fingers interlacing, grounding them both. Yet even as connection deepened, misunderstandings crept in quietly, as they often do. He grew cautious when she spoke of moving again someday, of opportunities that might take her elsewhere, hearing instability where she meant possibility. She sensed his hesitation, mistaking it for disinterest, and pulled back just enough to create space where warmth had been. The shift was subtle, unspoken, but both felt it. Messages became shorter, responses slower. He told himself this was normal, that closeness always came with friction, but doubt began to whisper familiar warnings. He was too rooted, too cautious. She was too free, too untethered. One evening, after a long day that left him drained and irritable, a message from her went unanswered longer than he intended. By the time he replied, apologetic, she had already retreated behind politeness. They met again days later, tension hovering between them like fog. Conversation faltered, words felt heavier, misaligned. When he mentioned his daughter casually, she misread the distance in his tone, hearing exclusion where he meant protection. The misunderstanding flared quietly, contained but painful, and they parted that night with uncertainty clouding what had once felt so clear. Days passed without contact. Snow melted slowly, leaving behind slush and reminders of what had been buried. He returned to routine, to responsibilities that demanded focus, but the absence lingered, sharper now because it followed possibility. One evening, while helping his daughter with homework, he found himself staring out the window again, remembering how the storm had forced him to stay, how staying had changed everything. He realized then that he had allowed fear to speak for him, had chosen caution over honesty. The thought settled heavily, undeniable. He reached for his phone, hesitated, then typed, choosing words carefully, not to defend himself, but to explain. He told her he was afraid, not of her, but of losing what little stability he had built, of wanting something that might ask him to risk again. He did not ask for forgiveness, he simply told the truth. Hours passed. When her reply came, it was longer than any message before it. She admitted her own fear, her habit of leaving before being left, her assumption that closeness would eventually require sacrifice she didn't know how to make. She wrote about the storm, about how it had given her a glimpse of what staying could feel like, and how the thought of losing that scared her more than moving ever had. They agreed to meet again, not to fix things, but to understand them. When they sat across from each other days later, snow gone now, streets wet and ordinary, something steadier replaced the initial spark. They spoke honestly, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with laughter breaking through tension, acknowledging differences without turning them into threats. He realized connection did not have to mean certainty, only willingness. As they parted that evening, hands clasped briefly, he felt no grand resolution, no cinematic promise, just a quiet sense that whatever lay ahead would be faced together, not because a storm forced them to stay, but because they chose to. Spring arrived unevenly, as if unsure whether it was truly welcome. Patches of snow lingered in the shadows of buildings long after the streets cleared, stubborn reminders of a season that had changed him more than he expected. He noticed these things now, the way light shifted earlier in the evenings, the way air smelled different after rain, because paying attention had become a habit again. Seeing her did that to him. They fell into a rhythm that felt neither rushed nor hesitant, something negotiated quietly between two people who had learned the cost of assumptions. They met when they could, sometimes with his daughter in tow, sometimes alone, always honest about the limits of time and energy. She fit into his world carefully, respectfully, never demanding space he could not give, and he found himself offering it anyway, surprised by how natural it felt. Watching her kneel to talk to his daughter at eye level, listening as if the smallest story mattered, stirred something in him he had not allowed himself to imagine. Yet even as connection deepened, life tested them. Her work grew more demanding, pulling her into longer hours, occasional travel, conversations about opportunities elsewhere resurfacing with uncomfortable persistence. He told himself he understood, that he did not want to cage her possibilities. But late at night, when the house was quiet and doubts crept in, he wondered whether love could stretch far enough to hold two very different kinds of roots. She sensed his unease before he voiced it, as she often did, and one evening, after putting his daughter to bed, they sat together on the couch, the television muted, the room filled with the soft hum of appliances and unsaid questions. She spoke first, confessing that the idea of leaving frightened her now, not because of distance, but because of what she stood to lose. He admitted that the thought of staying scared him just as much, not because he didn't want her there, but because permanence felt like a promise he wasn't sure how to make without breaking something else. They did not argue. They listened, sometimes falling quiet, sometimes circling the same thoughts from different angles, learning that understanding did not require immediate solutions. Weeks passed, and with them came small moments that anchored them, shared dinners, walks that turned into conversations lasting longer than intended, the simple comfort of presence. He watched his daughter grow attached, cautiously at first, then with the open trust only children possess, and felt both joy and fear twist together inside him. He remembered how fragile young hearts could be, how easily change could feel like loss. One afternoon, when his daughter asked if she would be coming to the school play, he saw the question ripple through her face, the weight of it settling heavily. She said yes without hesitation, and when she showed up that evening, sitting beside him, applauding too loudly at all the wrong moments, he felt something inside him shift irrevocably. Afterward, walking home under a sky streaked with late sunlight, she confessed that she had once believed she wasn't meant for this kind of life, that loving someone else's child felt like borrowing a future that wasn't hers to keep. He stopped walking then, turning to face her, and told her that love didn't always ask for ownership, only commitment to the present. His words surprised him as much as they did her. The real test came quietly, without drama. An offer arrived for her, one she had been working toward for years, a position that promised growth and purpose but required relocation. She told him immediately, voice careful, eyes searching his face for something she didn't yet know how to ask for. He felt the familiar tightening return, the instinct to protect what little stability he had built. But this time, he did not retreat into silence. Instead, he asked questions, listened to her hopes, her fears, her reluctance to frame the decision as a choice between ambition and connection. Days stretched into long conversations, spreadsheets and calendars spread across the table, practicalities examined with painful thoroughness. His daughter sensed the shift, the seriousness, and grew quieter, more watchful. One evening, after she had gone to bed, he admitted his deepest fear, that loving her meant eventually letting go, that staying together would require sacrifices neither could predict. She took his hands, grounding him, and said that uncertainty had always existed, that the storm had taught her how fragile and precious staying could be. She did not ask him to follow her. She did not ask him to stay behind. She asked him to decide with her. In the end, the decision was not dramatic. They chose distance, temporarily, choosing honesty over resentment, trust over control. She would take the position, commute when possible, return often, leave space for reevaluation. It was not perfect, but it was real. The first goodbye was harder than either expected. Standing on the platform as the train pulled in, the future compressed into a single moment. He held her longer than necessary, breathing her in, aware that this was what loving bravely felt like. Life adjusted again, days filled with routines, nights with calls that stretched until sleep claimed them both. He learned to share his world through screens, to invite her into mundane moments, to trust that presence could exist beyond proximity. His daughter adapted too, drawing pictures, sending messages, learning that love could travel. There were moments of doubt, nights when loneliness pressed harder, when misunderstandings threatened to reopen old wounds. But they met those moments with the tools they had learned, speaking sooner, listening longer, staying even when it felt easier to withdraw. One night, months later, as he tucked his daughter in, she asked when the next storm would come. He smiled, brushing hair from her face, and said some storms didn't come to disrupt, but to remind people how to find their way back. As he turned off the light, his phone buzzed with a message from her, a simple photo of the city she now navigated, unfamiliar yet hopeful. He lay back, staring at the ceiling, and realized that love, like weather, was unpredictable, but staying open to it had taught him something vital, that meaningful connections weren't defined by how they began or where they unfolded, but by the courage to keep choosing them, even when the forecast remained uncertain. The year turned quietly, without announcement. Seasons folded into one another the way pages did when read too quickly, and before he fully realized it, winter began edging back into the city again, softer this time, less dramatic, but no less persistent. The distance between them had become a landscape of its own, familiar, navigable, yet still demanding attention. They learned its contours through repetition, scheduled calls that became sacred, weekends counted down like small holidays, silences that no longer meant withdrawal but rest. He discovered that love did not always arrive with certainty. Sometimes it arrived with calendars, compromises, and faith built slowly through consistency. His daughter grew taller, more expressive, her questions sharper. She spoke of her as if she were already part of their story, not with expectation, but with acceptance. And it humbled him how easily children adapted to truths adults feared. There were hard days, days when exhaustion dulled patience, when miscommunications resurfaced, shaped now by time zones and missed connections. On those days, old instincts whispered that this was proof it could not last, that he should prepare again for disappointment. But he had learned something from the storm that first brought them together, leaving early spared pain, but staying taught meaning. So he stayed. She stayed too in her own way, choosing presence even when physically absent, choosing honesty over avoidance. Slowly, the question of what came next stopped feeling urgent and began feeling possible. The turning point did not arrive with an argument or a grand decision, but with an ordinary evening. She came home unexpectedly early one Friday, snow dusting her coat as it had that first night, eyes bright with nervous excitement. They stood in the doorway for a moment, neither moving, then laughed at themselves and closed the distance. Over dinner, she told him that the position she had taken had fulfilled its purpose, that she had grown, learned, proven what she needed to prove. She told him she no longer wanted a life defined by motion alone. She wanted one defined by connection. She did not say she was moving back. She simply said she was ready to choose. He listened, heart steady, fear present but no longer in control. He thought of the man he had been that night in the cafe, preparing to leave before being seen. He thought of the storms he had survived alone, the ones that had taught him endurance but not warmth. "Stay," he said finally, not as a plea but as an invitation. The word felt right in his mouth. What followed was not effortless. Adjustments had to be made, lives merged carefully, intentionally. She found work that aligned with her values, that kept her close without shrinking her world. His routines shifted, expanded, making room for shared mornings, shared silences. There were moments of doubt still, moments when he worried about the impact of permanence on his daughter, but watching them together erased much of that fear. Love did not replace what had been lost. It added to what remained. One evening, as snow fell again, lighter, almost playful, they returned to the same cafe where everything had begun. It looked smaller now, less dramatic, but warm all the same. Sitting at the same table, he realized how different he felt, how much less afraid. She reached across the table, fingers lacing through his, and smiled. "Funny how storms work," she said. "They show you what you'd miss if you left too soon." He nodded, understanding fully now. Outside, snow continued to fall, quiet and steady, no longer a barrier but a backdrop. Later that night, walking home together, his daughter between them, hands held on both sides, he felt something settle deep within him. Not the thrill of beginnings, but the peace of arrival. Life would still bring uncertainty, love would still demand courage. But he had learned that meaningful connections often arrived disguised as inconvenience, that the moments we nearly abandon can become the ones that change us most. As they reached their door, warm light spilling out to meet them, he thought of that first night again, of the chair pushed back, the coat already on, the decision nearly made. And he understood, with quiet clarity, that sometimes fate doesn't shout. Sometimes it arrives late, breathless, carrying snow on its shoulders, and asks only one thing in return, that you stay long enough to listen.